Hello class, today we're starting our section on arguments and persuasion. Even if you work through this lecture, I highly recommend you read up on the chapters to supplement your knowledge. I'm going to focus on considerations that are extraneous to what's presented in the books. But as the title slide says, arguments and persuasion, persuasion is not convincing someone necessarily. Arguments are not just a shouting match, but our own natural human tendencies might make us feel this way, and so we have to receive training to understand how to do this more effectively, and we definitely need to then make an effort to ensure our writing is more appropriate to this task. That being said, you know more than you realize, and so we're just going to get to that. This one will be a longer lecture, so whereas normally I have, maybe one 10-minute lecture, 15-minute lecture count as one day, this one I imagine will count as two since we're going straight through. You're welcome. In keeping up with a concept that we've already introduced to you, argument and persuasion in casual conversation may be synonyms and interchangeable, and certainly for the sake of assigning the papers, I use them like that, but you need to understand the difference between the terms so that you can be more effective at utilizing them. Argument is when you seek or clarify the truth. You're hopefully arguing what you think is true. However, others may be misguided, misled, or have a complete picture, and so in that case, you're trying to make it clear for them. You don't seek to change minds or browbeat anyone. Your goal should be then, and so this lines up appropriately for the class, should be to present your position as valid. Doing so, people disagree with you will probably still be upset because you've challenged their point of views and perspectives. But after they get over that, they'll come back and reconsider your points, and if you are truly right and correct, they'll come along. Think about why we believe what we believe. It's because usually what we have to, how we've been raised, and these are important to us, and being subjected to wrongness, it's not a word, but just so you can know, is an unpleasant experience to say the least. However, it's necessary to subject ourselves to that so that we can approach being right. Persuasion is determining the best course of action, and you notice best is in quotation marks. If there was only the best thing to do, there would be no argument made. We would just do that. But we never have unlimited resources, time, assistance, anything. Sometimes we have to compromise with what's achievable, what's practical, what's affordable, all these things. And so when I say best, that's what I mean. Sometimes you still won't really make people satisfied with that. I bring these up because an argument essay, maybe there's multiple explanations for a situation and that can guide your paragraphs and whatnot, but more likely you'll have to look at it from different perspectives, medical, psychological, historical, sociological, something like that. Same approach you could take with a research paper. Persuasive types of essays, you can certainly though work through each of the options and explain why one makes more or less sense, why we definitely don't want to do one, and so use that guidance for putting together your essay. There's just a few more concepts right here. Sophism is arguing to win, utilizing the techniques you learn in the presentation and construction of arguments merely to argue for the exercise. This is somewhat what we have in our adversarial legal system, where the persecution always argues that the other side is guilty and the defense always argues that they are not guilty. Of course, we must be mindful and talk about manipulation. That is any efforts at intimidation, deception, or whatever you can do to get people to do what's best for you and not necessarily best for them. You should avoid that. You can further delineate arguments by classifying them. We have a list here. And the approach to these types of arguments are different. Now think of the analogy to, a rectangle is a four-sided object. A square is a four-sided object with equal sides. All rectangles are not squares, but all squares are rectangles. So these are all arguments, but they're not all necessarily proposals. If you're not clear of something that's being done or that's happened, and then you need to reconstruct the events like you would, say, a court case, a trial, these are arguments of facts. It's not a matter necessarily that you're speculating what really happened. It's just that we don't have a complete picture unless we have full audio recording and videotape, and even then the motivations and ideas behind it might be suspect. Definitions are when we examine the nature of a topic, a position, a stance. When you argue if something truly qualifies as like a true insert political stance here. Evaluation is when we consider the value, the quality of something. A lot of then awards are given not based on something being the best, even if that's in the title, but the components of such things. A movie, if it's good, has a number of factors into it: acting, directing, cinematography, of course the story. So many things that could go wrong or right to line up to make it great. Sometimes you just like the action, but a thing is a little silly. Anything has components, and if you examine these components, how they work together, you have an evaluation. Causality is kind of like a little bit evaluation and a little bit fact. You look at, if something has caused something else, and it's not always clear. There's three concepts which you need to be aware of: causality, correlation, and coincidence. Causality, again, there's a provable, linkable connection between events and whatnot. Correlation is they happen, they're related, but do they actually link and cause each other to happen? Maybe not. And coincidence, just randomness. Of course, proposals is then perhaps another synonym for persuasion. What should we do in a situation? Of course, we have to consider a number of other concepts when discussing arguments. A fact is a verifiable, provable statement. Now, there then exist unproven, unverified facts, but their utility in argument is limited. We also then have opinions, concepts which will never be proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. These include matters of tastes. These include speculation or guess. And a lot of people consider then their opinion because they hold it as proof and verification of that position. Statements lacking verification are ostensibly opinions and relatively useless for arguments. Or rather, if someone has to like you if they accept your opinion, and that takes us to the notion of bias. Bias is preconceived notions, or what you get out of the argument by winning or being correct beyond being right. If there's some benefit from someone doing what you'd want them to do besides the best thing being done, that's bias. If you like someone, you probably are positively disposed towards the points they make. It shouldn't be a factor in things, but it's always a factor and must be considered. You need to be able to identify bias and also strive to limit your own presentation of bias in your argument, because it becomes something that can work against you. Null hypothesis is the notion that just because someone doesn't prove you wrong, you're right, or vice versa. You can't say you don't know, or you can't say I'm wrong and I can't say you're right. Well, if you're making a stronger claim, I think it's incumbent on you as the arguer to offer the evidence. Some indicators of bias might be inflammatory or slanted language. If someone uses what could be dubbed as politically incorrect terminology in the subject or topic, or in reference to other individuals or groups, it's a good sign they're they don't like those groups, and then you need to be suspicious of them because they're saying they're giving away their position, and are they using that because of a lack of character, moral fiber, or more frequently, rather than actually argue main points, they're trying to speak to already people's biases. They're trying to tell it like it is, and well, that's certainly not academic, and it's a bad part of life. You don't want to be putting badness out there. Certainly in your own essays, it's a sign that you're listening to the wrong types of experts or individuals. It's not a matter of being technically correct. Most stereotypes, which are also indicators of bias, are not true anymore of a specific group than they are most people randomly, and it's just not enough. It's not a sign of anything but your own problems. So what I've laid out here is a very basic argument structure. Now, first of all, if you're doing a shorter answer, a shorter response for a test or something, this might be an appropriate way to do it, one sentence, one sentence, one sentence. But really you want to consider, which of these are pretty straightforward, clear statements, like one sentence, and which are, things that you might need to elaborate upon, go on for, paragraphs even. But anyway, a claim is your point to be argued. Now in the argument itself, this can include your thesis or your topic sentences, either your main point or some of the reasons or subtopics that you're going to be dealing with. Lacking anything else, this is more of an opinion statement, and a lot of people present their opinions or assumptions and then they just reword them or reiterate them and think they've made an argument. Or they might introduce other points that are building off the initial claims. You want to avoid doing this. Grounds are supporting facts, figures, research, expert opinion, experience, stories. There's too many to name. But you want to be careful. Again, you're not just making an argument if you give a list of information, nor is an argument merely saying what you think and then saying reason why without further explaining yourself. Think of data versus information. Data versus evidence. Data is information. Evidence is data that you use to make an argument. So how do you handle your data and turn it into evidence? Well, avoid thinking that the facts speak for themselves, because they don't. People can jump to the wrong conclusions when you lay out pieces of evidence. An argument is a guided thought process. You're saying, hey, think of this, and then that's happening because of these things, and so if we do this like these other people did, we'll deal with it. So your claim and your grounds, that's not the majority of your essay. A claim is a few sentences at most per page. Grounds, maybe you're just dropping in a few statements, a few clauses, a few numbers even. Or maybe you're using a lengthier bit of argument that or a lengthier piece of evidence that you have to explain for a paragraph or so. So your whole essay, the majority of it, should not be those sentences and that information. You are talking about that information and putting your own spin on it. So that leads you to then the main component of an argument, your warrants, which are where you connect the claim and the grounds. These are the conclusions you want your reader to reach from the evidence. Now, each manner of evidence has problems, and you need to deal with these problems. Experience, well, two people can go through the same thing and have different experiences, and it's not a matter of who's right. It's a matter, more appropriately, of what's more applicable. Who's going to have the more frequent experience, and how can you show that? If you're talking with an expert, why do we want to hear what this expert has to say? If you're dealing with an expert who's right about a lot of things, but he has a few glaring weaknesses or personal problems or whatever, you need to then consider that information and how your audience will take it when you're using that bit of evidence. It doesn't prove him wrong, but it might be something you have to consider. Lastly, you might have some kind of conclusion statement. little conclusion, not like at the end of your essay. In that case, that's just a claim that comes towards the end of your paragraph, or after you've been laying out your evidence and explaining yourself and why those matter. You can build to one of your smaller claims and say, well, think about this, and now there's this other thing, and all that makes sense because whatever, and because of all that we should know whatever. So because it's such a central part of your argument, I wanted to list a number of possibilities for warrants. If you want to take on, admit to, or excuse the bias of your sources, that's fine. You might examine the motivations of why the researchers or whoever you're gathering from are reporting or trying to figure out the information, because that will have some bearing on then if you use their information for your own points. If there are limitations or exceptions to the evidence you bring up, you don't want to be caught with your pants down if someone who's disputing your points tries to argue with you, so you'll want to face those head on. You can hopefully use good evidence for everything, but if your argument is more of an attack on other people's points or the quality of their own evidence, you can explain the limitations of other perspectives, grounds. But ultimately you're talking about, why do you bring up this information over all other information? Usually you can find a lot of evidence on one side or the other, and usually you have to fight your own desires for confirmation bias to then say, well, this makes me look good, this helps me out, so it must be right. Again, if you want to explain, how your evidence is common or typical, your experiences is applicable to the masses instead of just a few specific groups, that might be something you might use for a warrant. And again, if things that prove you wrong or ways that people can jump to the wrong conclusions from your evidence, that would be useful to then explain before your reader starts coming up with those ideas themselves. You'll want to consider your audience, and the way I approach audiences in argumentation is like a survey. There's strongly agree, strongly disagree, agree, disagree, I don't know, and perhaps even I don't care. The people who strongly agree with you are already on your side, and the people who disagree with you, maybe they can have their minds changed, but the people who agree with you could possibly be turned off by your methods if you don't do it correctly, or might think that you don't represent the cause appropriately. And the people who strongly disagree are probably never going to come over to your side. Now, if you're doing an argument, your job might be to slightly, while still being argumentative, inform those who don't know or don't think the topic matters to them, or they don't care about it. You'll also want to then try not to antagonize those who disagree, who still might change their mind and join you. Consequently, if you're writing a persuasive type of essay, you're more concerned probably with people who already agree with you on some level, or people who don't know, and so that should inform what you do, definitely. Now, Aristotle codified 3 ways of appealing to one's audience: pathos, ethos, and logos. And these being Greek terms, they have some basis in our own English as well as other languages. So words you might know that are close or similar to these terms might help you understand it. Pathos is, of course, emotion, and using emotion to appeal to your audience. So you might think sympathy or empathy. Sympathy being, of course, feeling bad or sorry for someone, and empathy, understanding their emotions. Ethos is a little tricky. It can be derived from, or it's what's called ethical appeals. And so these are also matters of authority and credibility. And so, I think ethos, authority, but it's not exactly there, but that's how you might look at it. Logos is, of course, logic, not logos as in the golden arches or whatever. And this is logic and reasoning, trying to explain how things make sense as well as the use of your evidence. Pathos is tricky, because think of the definitions of arguments and persuasion. Argument, seek or clarify the truth. Well, if you're overcome with emotion, are you look at things clearly? Probably not. Or to put it another way, there's a a bit of advice that's life advice for if you're feeling upset with someone or about a situation. You want to sit down and write how you feel until you say everything you need to say, or your hand hurts and you got to stop. Then you put that note in a letter and you hide it somewhere. You don't do this like an email or a text, because the point is not to send it off, and that's very easy to do with a text or email. You would then come back to this and just try and read it. Now, if things make sense, try to make it better. Try and deal with it. Try and see what you need to do to improve your situation. But more likely, you're going to look at it and see how ridiculous the whole situation is, and certainly you'll feel bad once you say these things to someone. And so the writing down of stuff is purgative of our emotions. It's confessional. It can help us feel better by the mere action. And we then can think about how to deal with the problem with a clear head. A lot of people have conflict and they wait till it blows up into a fight, and maybe they feel bad about the stuff said during the fight, but that's not an argument in the sense that we're trying to understand who's at fault or what can be done about it. I bring this up also because if you read emotion in argumentation, usually you can be suspicious of it, because again, writing is purgative. If someone is writing emotionally, you have to suspect, are they in control of themselves or are they being sneaky? They're writing to kind of make you feel these emotions so they can then take advantage of your lack of control or awareness of the situation. And it certainly should not make up for a lack of evidence or even bad evidence. Observe it. There's of course a question of if someone's passionate and moved to action because of how they feel and what they believe, or if they're again overcome with an emotion. In an argument, this would be the category of a warrant, because then it's your job to then make that assessment and explain yourself in your own essay. Like I said earlier, ethos is one's authority, integrity, respect, character, credibility, your ethics. There's a few considerations though with this. Now certainly someone who was of strong morality or moral fiber or character would give you good advice, would guide you the right way, because they would consider what was right and wrong, good, and so on and so forth. But some individuals also have, by virtue of their position, job, status, wealth, whatever, have authority, and so they are entitled then to tell others what to do, maybe without justifying it themselves or not. In an argument, an examination of authority in the form of the sources, as well as how you would establish it yourself, is an important part to consider. It's literally sentences you'll be thrown in there, maybe paragraphs. How can one get authority? Well, they might have an experience with the issue. Maybe they've studied it and so they're an expert. Or maybe they have that position to say such things. Now obviously there cannot be complete good authority without the knowledge and experience to back it up, but knowing the real world, we know plenty of people benefit from false authority or authority that's not rightfully earned. You'll want to consider this when you talk about such things, and so you want to establish or have it for yourself by sounding like you know what you're talking about, being able to make a case that yes, I'm someone you should be listening to. For your experience and connectedness to a topic, that can do a good job of that. You just want to also be sure that you're overcoming the bias of your own experience, and that is to say that you don't overvalue your experience as the sole source of evidence or grounds for your overall argument. You want to move away from just talking about, you should listen to me, that's what I think, just because most people get stuck there. And if you do better than that, you'll do better at arguing. The appropriate level of terminology and sounding knowledgeable, presenting your information accurately and effectively, is a good way to establish your authority. Now, obviously, spelling, grammar, punctuation don't prove you wrong if you have good facts, but they do give the impression that you weren't taking the assignment or the task seriously enough to get it edited and do it properly. You might then examine your sources or present your own credentials. Credibility is an important part of ethos, and it's trust. And how do we build trust? We have a history with someone that they haven't let us down, or they stick by us through the thick and thin. It's proven. I think, forgive me for my weird analogies, but think of, like, you know, criminal organizations. I'm personally a fan of, like, mafia films or whatever. What's the biggest, you know, value that they don't want you to talk about, or rather they want to have in those type of stories? You don't, you know, snitch, you don't rat. That's because everyone's done any number of crimes, and so they also have, you know, dirt on you. And so, you know, if you break that trust, the whole organization can collapse. And if you look at history, it frequently does. So again, keep your interest in organized crime and mafia films in the movies and stories, and not in real life. Lacking the history of dealing with something you should not trust. For the sake of argumentation and writing, if you put information in your paper without, you know, considering the credibility of it, you're saying, I trusted this is totally right. So you should make it clear as to why you're bringing up your experts, your information, and why it's good stuff, and explain that. But also, when you're looking for it, you'll want to make sure that the sources of information you rely upon are peer-reviewed journals. They're by the experts, who then help you verify all that information and methods. If they're a good source, they're open about that sort of stuff. If they're a shady source, you can't verify things. And usually this is information you're getting off the internet that was stolen from good sources, so just keep digging and go to the good sources, if you will. Lastly, we have logos, and this is tricky because you get any number of classes in the philosophy department, so I'll try and give you what you need here. Logos is both how you use your evidence, the reasons, the facts, and whatnot, but also how you use logic and reasoning. You know, what thoughts you guide your reader through to convince them to see things your way. So, a few other concepts. Generalizing is when you reach a conclusion with limited evidence. Now, you will never have all the evidence you need. It's your job to then judge and speak confidently and say, hey, I have enough evidence. And that's your call. Again, the essay will be unwieldy if there's too much information, or you bring up too many examples of, you know, sad or tragedies that could have been prevented by doing a certain thing. So you need to use enough evidence, and you need to explain why you think it's enough evidence. Consequently, assumptions are when you reach a conclusion with no evidence. There's no use for these sort of things, but a lot of people use them unconsciously because in your head your ideas are perfectly formed and make perfect sense, and it's someone else's inability to understand the situation if they don't go along with you. People also make this mistake of building arguments with assumption built on top of assumption. You know, they claim that something is true or just the way it is, and so then we need to do this other thing without proving how that first point was true before they move on to not proving how their next thing is the right answer to it. We also then have deductive reasoning, which is when you have a generalization which you then apply to a specific scenario. This is like in court cases. We have a crime and a definition of a crime and whether or not it was committed, and then we look at the situation and see if the evidence proves that, yeah, that person did what they were accused of. We also have inductive reasoning, which is when you have a number of specific examples and you jump to a conclusion because of that. Again, it's a big jump if you don't have enough examples, but if you're constructing an argument based on scenarios and situations, it's your job to then say, hey, I do have enough examples. There are just a few other parts to consider with argumentation. One big aspect of it is differences in culture and changes in values. Obviously, things are a lot safer and more tolerant and progressive now than they were several, even decades ago. Not even that long ago. The world has changed, and so you have to consider this when making your arguments. When you go to different cultures, societies, even in the same country, again, those must be considered. Consequently, you might also then think, going back to how there's not ever the best situation, there's just what's better, what makes sense. So we might have to worry about degrees. We do something bad now for a payoff later, or something that seems bad now for a payoff later, or maybe we do the less or the least bad that we can do. Sometimes you can argue a point with an analogy. That is, you compare one idea that's fairly complex to a simpler idea. And then sometimes we think, well, we've always done it this way, so that's how it works. Think of when people get multiple life sentences for a crime. You probably only need one life sentence, so why is there more of them? Well, it's more of a gesture, to say this is a pretty egregious, or worse by a number of degrees, crime that we need to deal with. So the last part we're going to cover about argumentation is something called classical oration. Classical oration is the structure of an argument, and so it's a good way to outline your whole thing, and you're probably already doing this for reasons which will become clear in a bit, but it is a little tricky with some of the words, so I'm going to try and help you understand them as well. First, we will have exordium, which is where you get the audience's attention and goodwill. Now, think of this by exo. Now, exo is like an exoskeleton, you're on the outside of something. And so before you've started your argument, you need to tell everyone, hey, listen to me. Think back to ancient Greece. Ancient Greece was a democracy with a little asterisk. But the town would get together and vote what they wanted to do. But even before newspapers, internet, and cell phones, when you get a group of people together, they got to catch up, they got to talk, they got to, just say, hey, what's going on? And so if you want to then interject and try to argue your point, you would have to say, hey, shut up and listen to me. But if you tell someone to shut up, they don't want to listen to you. And so consequently then you need to impress upon them why you should be the one heard. The next thing is narratio, and that's when you explain the situation, the story surrounding the argument. Why are we here? What are we discussing? So you can give background information on the topic as in the introductory phase of your argument. These first three things, exordium, narratio, or partitio, is an argumentative phase of things. So you have some options when you use narratio. If you explain things to say, hey, why we're here, you are ingratiating yourself with the audience. They don't know why we're talking about what we're talking about, but they're saying, hey, thank you for giving me this information. Even if they don't say out loud, they feel that way. You can also make your side look good, and that is fair to do. Don't overdo it, but you're already making yourself look good. You're saying, hey, this guy is knowledgeable. Let's hear what he has to say. You have the opportunity to then make the other side look bad, but be careful with this. It's a trick that may or may not work. If most of your audience is undecided and unaware, they won't know. But if you're trying to change people's minds, your first impression is to then antagonize them, which you might not want to do. Then, of course, you do partitio, which is where you lay out basically your thesis, the points that you're going to be covered. Now again, narratio sounds like narration. That's the root word where we get narrative from, so the story of the argument is how you would remember that. Partitio sounds like part or partition, which is you divide the topic up, and so that's how you remember that. Those are the introductory phases of your argument. If you do a few sentences for each, you're not doing it wrong. The next parts, however, are where you do the vast majority of your essay, so don't think it's just one paragraph for each. Confirmatio is where you offer detailed support for your claim. You say, here's the reasons why I'm right, here's my bits of evidence, here's the logic and how I'm going to convince you. And again, that's how many pieces of evidence you need. How many points do you need to make? Well, it's better to really be focused and say a lot about a little bit. A lot of other English topics or tutors or whatever say you need 3 reasons and then you need 3 pieces of evidence for each of those. Maybe, maybe not. If you're running through them real quickly, it's not enough. You could really have like 2 good topics that you're talking about which have lots and lots of reasons underneath each of them. You need enough, in other words. Then you do refutatio, which is where you acknowledge and refute the opposition. Basically, you think, okay, why do people think I'm wrong? And why are they actually the ones that are wrong? So here's the deal with that. The best thing to do, and you'll probably do this as you lay out your main points, is to say why you're right and why the other side is wrong. And if they have bits of evidence that hurt your case, you'll want to, disprove them. You'll want to say why they're inaccurate, invalid, or they don't apply here. If someone's solution is, hey, let's do something like they're doing, and you don't want to do that, you could make the point by saying, well, over there they're different, and it's not the same as over here, so it won't work. But here's the deal. If you're arguing with someone, well, think back to when you were a kid. Your parents, did ever tell you, if you just tell me what you did wrong, you won't be in as much trouble? Now, they were lying to you, and parents do this for all across human history. They'll feel bad about punishing you wrongly, so if they can extract a confession from you, they are spared some of that discomfort, and so maybe they punish you less, maybe not, but also you don't even know unless they made the mistake, which they probably only do once, of saying, well, I'll punish you for a month unless you confess, then I'll punish you for 3 weeks. Because if they just tell you you'll be in less trouble, you don't know if they've lowered your punishment or whatever. That all being said, I think we've all gone through this, and so it's all worked on us. And even politicians, whenever they get in trouble with something, a lot of them have a press conference where they admit to their wrongdoing and confess and ask for forgiveness. Think of like in sports, and these are all analogies too, so if you needed examples, here you go. Think of in sports, if someone's a cheater and they keep denying and denying and denying after they've been caught, people are intolerant of it. That's how it works in my preferred sport of mixed martial arts. If someone's popped for steroids and they just keep shifting blame on everything else, that's it. Eventually people forget, of course. But the ones who admit to wrongdoing, confess, and are apologetic, they really say, well, look, it's a tough sport. This is my livelihood. I got to feed my family. It's not so much excuses, even if it is, but by virtue of owning up to it, they're admitting they're human, and everyone's human. There's some benefit in argument of saying, hey, look, these points prove me wrong, and I can't do anything about that, because then you're also saying, hey, I think I've done a good job anyway, and so they're important, but they don't matter to what we're doing here. And so really you're saying, you're defanging your opposition. Also, to the reader, you're not being caught off guard. So if they think of something and then you say, yeah, I know that's messed up, but we got to do it, they're not shocked and like, oh wow, this person's admitting something, but it's a good position to take. So lastly, and so I want to be careful with peroratio. Peroratio is where you would move the audience to action. Now, classical oration has influence on writing essays and speech. So this is where you'll get the bad advice to summarize in your conclusion. And this is the concluding phase of things as well. Don't do that. We've already gone on what to do for conclusion, so I'll defer to that. But I will say, refutatio is a possibility for a conclusion. If you then say, well, people don't agree with me for all these reasons, but, that's no big deal. I made a good point. If you don't want to go in deep with those, that's actually a good place to stop. So as was implied just now, these concepts in classical oration have shaped our argument, and they have a place in, when we talk about introduction, conclusion, and our body paragraphs. So what I've included here is another outline that is in English and not ancient Greek to then use to lay out your argument. So follow that if you want to get started. And again, for lines of argument, alternate arguments, again, that's as many as it takes. Don't just use one paragraph or even a few paragraphs talking about one thing with each of those categories.